I am Judith Gamboa, and I am a board member, former board member as of August, of Kol Haskalah, the humanistic Jewish congregation of the Triangle of North Carolina. And I am honored to present two of the leading lights of the humanistic Jewish movement, Rabbi Adam Shalom and Rabbi Jody Kornfeld, who have together edited and authored some of the articles in the book Contemporary Humanistic Judaism, which has just been published through JPS. And just to say a bit about who our authors are, Rabbi Jody Kornfeld is the rabbi of, it just escaped me. Can you say what it is?
Sure. Beth Chavarim Humanistic Jewish Community.
Okay, and is a recognized expert on Jewish art, and also has a DSJS from Spertus, and has contributed articles and about Jewish art to some various resources. And then we have also Rabbi Adam Shalom, who is the Dean of the International Institute of Secular Humanistic Judaism, which ordains humanistic rabbis and other officiants, and also a congregational leader of Kol Chadash. Both congregations are in the greater Chicago area, and Rabbi Shalom has a PhD from the University of Michigan. And I guess I'll let you go forward. And I'll put myself on mute too.
All right. And I'll also just make a couple of logistical notes. You'll see that there's both a chat and the Q&A. As we're going through our presentation, if you have some questions or comments on things that we're saying, feel free to drop them into the chat, and we'll circle back to be able to address them. We're going to offer sort of frontal presentations initially, but we'll have plenty of chance to get back to those questions or comments and make it a little bit more interactive later in the presentation. The other thing I'll mention about the book is that it's available from the Jewish Publication Society. You can actually get a discount if you order it directly from jps.org. It's also on Amazon. It's on ebook formats and in other platforms. I think there are even used copies by now because it's been out for pre-order purchases started showing up in November. So it's been going for some time. Well, I'm here to talk about high holidays without the holy, and specifically to look at an explanation of humanistic Judaism through that lens of approaching the high holidays. In my experience, it's relatively easy to explain what we mean by humanistic Judaism, that it's a cultural Jewish identity that understands Judaism as a culture and civilization, including art, language, music, food, and things like religion, literature, holidays, life cycle events that are conventionally understood as religious. So our cultural Judaism is expressed through a human-focused approach to life. Our philosophy is focused on the natural world, what people can know and do for each other and together. It's, if you want to put it in a slogan, it's this life, this world, these hands, and you working together, and using that to celebrate our Jewish cultural identity and heritage. And when we talk about humanistic Judaism in the abstract as a philosophy and an approach to life, many people find that it resonates with their experience, with their beliefs and values, and even with their way of identifying with being Jewish. But then you get to step two. And step two is, well, okay, I understand this in theory, but what do you do with Yom Kippur? What do you do with a bar mitzvah? How does this apply in the real world? When the rubber hits the road, how do things change? So I want to talk briefly about specifically Yom Kippur, because people will often say, how can you do Yom Kippur if you're focused on this life and this world and not looking for divine judgment or divine forgiveness, and not focused on the creation of the world, which is the rabbinic version of the Jewish New Year, imagining it was not just the New Year for a calendar, but it was the new of the new year for the universe, 5,785 or 86 years ago. Well, we have to start our understanding of Yom Kippur from a humanistic perspective from asking the question, why did the ancestors of our people decide that this time of year was the time of judgment, a time when it would be decided who would live and who would die. And for that, we have to turn to the natural calendar. In the land of Israel, in the fall, it's just before the rainy season begins. And the rainy season is indeed when it seems the universe is deciding who will live and who will die. Because if the rains come on time, there'll be enough food. Excuse me. If the rains come on time, there will be enough food. If too much rain comes or too little rain comes, there will not be. And so at that time of year, it was thought it would be very important to atone for sins, to be forgiven, because the rains were coming and the cosmos would decide who would live and who would die. That's the psychology behind setting a time of judgment in this time of year. But if you read the passages in the Torah about this season, you notice, first of all, it wasn't the new year back then. It was the fall season, but it was not the new year. The new year was in the spring in the calendar in Leviticus. But when it was a time of judgment, this became the opportunity to look to atone for sins against God, but also in the rabbinic turn, in a humanistic shift, to focus on the sins between people, the offenses that we commit to each other. In rabbinic literature, it says very clearly that there are two kinds of sins that are atoned for on the Day of Atonement. The violations ben adam lemakom, between a person and their God, and ben adam lechavero, between a person and their fellow. And they even said, in a very humanistic turn, one cannot ask for divine forgiveness for the wrongs done to other people until one is forgiven by the person that one has wronged. With that in mind, we can see going from a rabbinic approach to forgiveness that needs people to forgive first, excuse me. I've been afflicted by a cold, but I know it's not cosmic judgment because it would have happened 2 weeks later during high holidays. When Maimonides looked at this question of forgiveness, he even went further and said you have to present yourself multiple times to the person you've wronged to give them an opportunity to forgive you. And you have to offer their forgiveness freely if they've wronged you. It's a very difficult interpersonal dynamic. So when we turn to a humanistic approach, we continue that tradition of looking to forgive others who have wronged us if they are apologetic and offering the chance to apologize to them. And then we have a different shift. Instead of going from the interpersonal to above and beyond, looking for cosmic forgiveness, and certainly not sacrificing goats and the other rituals described in Leviticus chapter 16. What we do instead, as we look beyond to each other and into our community, we also look inside ourselves and see if there's a way that we can learn to forgive ourselves for the things that we have failed even within ourselves. So you can see there's a balance there of a continuity with the past. We want to maintain the importance of interpersonal relationship repair, but also a shifting of focus from the above and beyond to this world and to within ourselves. In a Yom Kippur service in a humanistic congregation, you will hear some familiar items. It will likely end with the blowing of the shofar. You will likely hear some version of the melody of Kol Nidre, which is deeply attached to the Yom Kippur evening service. You will hear sometimes choirs singing or individuals singing with beautiful voice. We do play instruments, so you will hear those. And what you will hear are readings, poetry, prose, largely in English, with the desire of inspiring thought, moving emotion, connecting community, but all around this theme of relationship repair, returning to our deepest self and values, and feeling part of that global Jewish people. What a humanistic high holidays reflects is some of the values of humanistic Judaism, that Jewish culture evolves over time. You know, at one time it was the rainy season, and then it was the casting of sins on a scapegoat and sending the scapegoat out into the wilderness to purify the people. And then it became this interpersonal dynamic and communal atonement through long services and afflicting one's soul by fasting. But over time, it's evolved again. It turns out that change itself is the Jewish tradition. And in our community, some choose to fast and some don't, but all of us choose to celebrate together with those shared values. A second principle is that this demonstrates that Jewish culture was created and recreated by the Jewish people over different time and over many centuries in response to their own values and beliefs and needs of their day. So if Maimonides can refocus on people, we can refocus on people even to not focusing on the above and beyond. And most importantly, we in humanistic Judaism try to celebrate our past and our current values, that continuity and that creativity of our own celebrations, with our full selves, with integrity. We want to use our head and our heart, what we believe and what we feel. We use multiple modes of silence and speech and singing and poetry and prose. We use Hebrew and English and other Jewish languages to reflect our diverse cultural experience, but also to provide inspiration. And we find a balance of individual expression and community common ground. Most importantly, we don't have to reinvent the secular Jewish wheel every year, because humanistic Judaism has been around since the early 1960s. We have multiple generations of people who have grappled with how do we do Yom Kippur from a humanistic perspective and have created meaningful services, celebrations, readings, and materials for us to use. And ultimately, the reason why Rabbi Kornfeld and I edited this volume called Contemporary Humanistic Judaism was that we wanted people to know that we're here, that you don't have to do this by yourself, that if you have these humanistic beliefs and a secular lifestyle, you don't have to compromise your values to observe Yom Kippur and activate that part of your heritage and culture and feel that kind of meaningful experience. You don't have to say what you don't believe. You can find a place that enables you to live your Jewish life with full head and full heart and full self. And so with that, I want to turn it over to Rabbi Kornfeld, who will talk a little bit more about our book, Contemporary Humanistic Judaism, Beliefs, Values, and Practices. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jody. Thank you.
Thank you. So just want to comment on just a couple of things that Rabbi Adam mentioned. So we will include, for instance, because it's very meaningful, is a memorial service where typically and traditionally it's Yizkor, you will remember, but instead we change the phrasing and it's Niskor, we will remember. But again, it serves a very important, not just a cultural need, but an emotional need. And it's very important for the people who are attending to be able to remember loved ones with the recitation of names or inclusion on a memorial plaque or whatever the case might be. And again, different readings, different music that would be appropriate for that piece of the service. Secondly, with regard to the issue of fasting, some communities, including mine, we will do a food drive on Yom Kippur. So we are taking into account that there was this idea that you went traditionally without food so that you could somehow have a greater intentionality about what you were doing instead of, as I remember growing up, only thinking about what I wasn't eating. So a food drive kind of serves that purpose of here's the groceries that perhaps would have been used for a day, and then it's given to a local food pantry. And then finally, just on the idea of what else is the meaning of the day, it's a time of deep self-reflection. That if we are going to figure out ways to forgive others, forgive ourselves, that's hard work. That's not something that comes easily. It's very difficult to really own up sometimes for our own actions and to turn to somebody and say, I'm really sorry. I didn't mean that. Or if it was something that you meant, then really to reflect on that and how you can change things going forward. So with that, the additional background of the book is it's divided into 4 sections, and the book is subtitled Beliefs, Values, and Practices. And across the different chapters, we try to address things that people who are familiar with humanistic Judaism might be inspired by. People who are not familiar might be educated by reading these things. And people who may just sort of be on the fence, they're just not sure. Are they going to sort of cross that bridge and realize that they are humanists, that this will also be a means of support for such people? I urge you that if you read the book, that you don't have to start at the very beginning and go all the way clear through to the very end. But don't just look up, for instance, Yom Kippur or high holidays, because they're sort of an interweaving in different places. So, for example, we include a chapter on liturgy, and there are some sample pieces of liturgy in there, including a tashlich ceremony for a reading that you would use on Rosh Hashanah if you're going to engage in that particular ritual. But there's also another chapter on spirituality. And how do we have natural spirituality? That if we are not looking to an external divinity or an external cosmic power that somehow is going to be in charge of or influence our lives, it doesn't mean that we are cold-hearted. It doesn't mean that we are, because we're reliant on science and rationality and evidence, we still have a very human need to satisfy that spiritual nature. And so what might that look like? We can experience a sense of transcendence because we are not the sole focus of the universe. We can take a look at something like the Grand Canyon and realize, I guess a little bit of a pun intended, why grand is used to describe it. We can take a look at art, we can experience music, and it satisfies that part of it. So when Rabbi Adam was speaking about what a high holiday service might look like, or a Yom Kippur service, and repeated prose and poetry and music, all of those things help us to get beyond ourselves. And when we do this in a communal setting, that satisfies, again, our human need for connection. So as we put the book together, we had a section on Jewish life, like how is this lived? It's one thing to talk about the philosophy, but how exactly do we live it? How do we celebrate life cycle events? How do we celebrate holidays? How do we educate our children? And even though I'm describing it as how do we, I want to be really clear, this is not a how-to book. So you could not sort of pick it up and say, oh, if I only copy this and paste it in here, now I've got a service to be created. Instead, it's how do we approach these things as we meet our very, very deep-seated human needs. And so in looking at that and reflecting the integrity that it takes to always say what we mean and mean what we say, which is a very popular phrase in our movement, and that applies to saying it in English and saying it in Hebrew or any other Jewish language, that there's integrity in our purpose, there's integrity in our actions, and that our actions and our words meet, that there's not sort of a dissonance between the two of them. So one further example, although we are obviously gathered to talk about the high holidays, I think that we can also look at, for instance, the holiday of Passover and what kinds of changes that might be more readily relatable, since the majority of Jews in America do some form of a Passover celebration, that they have some form of a Seder that they will be undertaking. And interestingly, the Haggadah, the book that we use for a Seder, there are more printed versions of the Haggadah than any other Jewish book. And so that is saying that, again, change, yes, change is a part of our tradition. We are not mired in one way of doing things. And I think that when we look at Passover and we see there can be a vegetarian Haggadah, there can be illuminated or illustrated Haggadot, that there's a women's Haggadah, that, all of these different things suggest to us that we are bringing our own personal experience, and with that experience, we are expanding the collective Jewish experience. We can invent new rituals. And so those rituals could be, for instance, putting a cup of water, a Miriam's cup, on the table to recognize the contribution of Jewish women. It could be, for instance, that vegetarians may put a beet on the Seder plate instead of a bone. All of these ways in which we say we don't turn our back, for instance, is what I'm saying. We don't turn our back on celebrating because it might not be the way we would think humanistic Judaism would celebrate it. Instead, we embrace the freedom that we have. And Passover is a good example because when Rabbi Shalom was talking about, when is the Jewish New Year, why is it that the high holidays are in the 7th month? When he's talking about the spring, that's Passover. That's why we continually adjust the Jewish calendar with a leap month, not just a leap day, because if it just sort of kept running on, Passover, which is a spring harvest holiday, would suddenly land in the fall. And that didn't work. Agriculturally, it didn't work for celebration. It didn't work for any of that. So instead, that's where our first month lies. So some things might appear very familiar to somebody who is new to humanistic Judaism, but comes from a different denomination or a different tradition. Some things will seem very familiar. At the high holidays, blowing of a shofar. At sometimes things might look very different. As I said, when we call our memorial service Niskor. And so all of these things are kind of teased out in the book, and the different selections that we had are important to take a look at in their entirety. Some of them, as I said, will be very specific to a very specific topic. But when I spoke to a group of humanistic Jewish educators, I urged them, I said, please don't only read chapter 14 entitled Education. Because while, yes, that is the main thrust of that chapter, there are so many other things that we can be doing to teach our children, to work in our schools, to understand our philosophy better. So it becomes really important from my point of view as the co-author, co-editor, that we view this sort of as in its entirety. I think that that is an approach that it will resonate with people, and they will find a great deal of support for how they want to approach their own humanistic Jewish celebration, because it's not that it becomes repetitive, but it becomes increasingly supportive. That, oh, if you do this at a life cycle event, if you do this when you educate your kids, if you do this when you celebrate a holiday, or you do this when you put together your liturgy, now you understand that humanistic Judaism is a practice and a belief system. It becomes second nature. Whereas sometimes people, I grew up in the conservative movement and skipped reform altogether. And sometimes I think there might be a tendency to sort of default to other denominational practices because either it's the only thing that you know, or sometimes because we want to keep peace in the family and we're part of a larger family that isn't necessarily all made up of humanistic Jews. So this book is really, we say in the preface that it's an invitation. It's an invitation to people to hopefully see themselves in it, to educate themselves in it, or if they are brand new to this and have never heard of it, to get the voice of humanistic Judaism amplified.
I want to confess that two of my favorite parts of the book are after the book. They're after the main text is concluded. One of them, in an afterword, we included some survey data of American Jews, where the Pew Forum on Religion in American Life and their research center asked a series of questions in the year 2020, and they came out with really startling numbers, except they weren't startling to us, because they asked questions like, do you believe in a God or the God of the Bible? Do you believe in a universal spirit, or do you not believe in either one of those? Something like 25% of American Jews or 20% of American Jews don't believe in either of those supernatural concepts. They're purely naturalistic. They ask people, how often do you attend synagogue services? Most Jews don't attend synagogue services. And they even asked them why. And they said, well, it doesn't reflect my beliefs and values. They asked people, what is your Jewish identity? Is it religion? Is it culture? Is it ancestry? And for large numbers, it was ancestry and culture. It had nothing to do with religion for them. These are our people. And part of the point of this book is to say, you are not alone, not in a cosmic sense, but in a practical human sense, that there are plenty of other secular inclined Jews and people who love them who are looking perhaps for a community of like minded believers, believers in positive human values. We tried to frame the book in positive terms all the way through, and with help from our editor who poked us occasionally. And the point was that we do have beliefs. We believe in human potential and human knowledge and human power. And we wanted to frame it in that positive terminology. That's why we call our movement humanistic Judaism and not some kind of negative anti-terminology. So the survey data I find fascinating. And the other detail at the end of the book that I think was both Rabbi Kornfeld's and my favorite part to put together was what we called Go Forth and Learn. We could have called it For Further Reading. Except it wasn't only reading, it was viewing, it was experiencing, because Jewish creativity is not confined to the word. You know, we've been called the people of the book, but we're also the people of the movie, and the people of the music, and the people of the artwork. And so we wanted a way to include ways to explore these themes and issues that we were grappling with beyond the printed page. And we also wanted to call it more than just For Further Knowledge, because there's a famous rabbinic story about a potential convert coming to Rabbi Hillel and asking him to teach this convert all of Judaism while standing on one foot. In other words, right away. And Hillel's response is, don't do to others what is hurtful to you. All the rest is commentary. Now go forth and learn. In other words, yes, I can teach you the core identity and the core issues in one sentence, but there's still more to do. There's still more to learn and explore. And so that's really what we hoped to leave people with. At the end of this volume, you've read 250 pages on humanistic Judaism. Now, here's some more things to explore. Here's some more ways you can dive into the sea of humanistic Jewish thought and relevant information. It could be a work of Jewish history. It could be a work on Jewish music. It could be Jewish recipes that you learn to make in your own kitchen. There is an infinite variety of expressions of Judaism that could be meaningful to you in your own personal way. So we wanted to empower people to start with the book, but don't stop with the book, to continue to learn, to read, to explore. What we do in my congregation for the high holidays, we do a Torah reading as part of the service. It's not the traditionally assigned reading every year, the same thing every time. We don't need to talk about the binding of Isaac every single year. What we do instead is we choose a Torah reading that is relevant to something we want to explore and discuss together. And that's for the evening service. We offer an evening and a morning service. In the morning service, I choose another piece from the wide range of Jewish literary expression. Could be poetry, could be prose, could be medieval, modern, elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, that's in dialogue with the earlier text. So people get the lesson that Jewish writing did not stop with the Torah, just as humanistic Jewish writing did not start and stop with this volume. And the other thing that I do is I take that other book, that other source, and I put that into our ark next to the Torah. The point is that in humanistic Judaism, our ark is wider. It may start with the Torah, but it does not end with the Torah or the Talmud or Rabbinic Judaism. It is ours that we are actively creating today as heirs, but also as bequeathers. We'll be passing it down. And so we get to take what we've inherited, to use what's meaningful to us, to adapt what's needed to be adapted for our use, and then to pass that on for our children to do what they're going to do with it. And so that's really the exciting part of being a humanistic Jew, is the freedom of the inheritor, but also the freedom of the creator, who then will be passing that down in their own right. So that's why we end with Go Forth and Learn, because this book is not the end, it's just the beginning.
And it really was one of our favorite sections as we were putting it together. But at the same time, it was almost outdated the minute the book came out because so much more continues to be produced. New art, new literature, new music, and so on. Just by way of example, there's a new animated series on Netflix called Long Story Short, which is all about a Jewish family. And I couldn't help as I was watching it thinking, if we were putting that together now, it would have been in there. So again, viewing the book kind of as this invitation, we created a study guide that's free and available on the JPS website and the section about our book. And one of the things if I recall correctly, is we said, what other things would you include if you were putting together Go Forth and Learn? For what kinds of materials, what other movies, what other books, and so on. So it really was. Our book, as Rabbi Shalom said, it's not the be all and end all. And I noticed a question in the Q&A about how our book is different than the books that Rabbi Wein had written. I think, and I'm sure that Adam has some thoughts on this too, but our book represents a generational shift. So while we have many essays by the founding thinkers, it went beyond that. So it included different voices, for instance. It included a Facebook discussion, which would not have been available back then, about ritual objects, about the wearing of a kippah, that certain things in the Guide to Humanistic Judaism, which sort of prompted the Facebook discussion, were you do it this way, and that's it. And it was very didactic in terms of how to behave as a humanistic Jew. And now people are saying, a few generations down, well, maybe, there is room to reinterpret this. Maybe there is a different way of understanding if I choose, not because I have to, but if I choose to wear a kippah, here's what it might be. The other thing is that I think it was 1995, if I'm remembering correctly, there was a volume called Judaism for the Secular Age. And it was a series of essays. And the essays are quite good. We used a piece, an excerpt of a piece by Yehuda Bauer that was in that volume, in our volume. But it needed sort of updating. We couldn't sort of view this as, here's the only anthology on humanistic Judaism, and if you take a look at that, there's everything that you need to know. So in that sense, it becomes different and expansive, but still very inclusive. We have quite a number of essays by Rabbi Wein because they still speak to us. His essay on believing is better than not believing, written in 1984, is still so resonant and powerful. And the whole idea that humanistic Jews are full of beliefs and that we don't define ourselves in contradistinction to other denominations and movements, because that diminishes us. It says they do this and we don't. Instead of, here's what we do. Here's what we believe. That is so much more empowering to ourselves and powerful as a message.
So one of my additional projects, in addition to being a congregational rabbi and directing the Institute and training rabbis, some years ago, we started a Sherwin Wein Legacy Project, where we took a lot of his writings, audio recordings, videos, and put together a website called sherwinwein.com. So I am very well versed in what I call Sherwinalia, which is out there. And Rabbi Wein was my rabbi growing up and in training as well. And I worked with him for a few years. So I got to be a first name basis with him. But in his books, some of them are very thorough and some of them are a product of their time. So his first major book was called Humanistic Judaism, which was published in 1978. It was a collection of essays early on in his thinking on humanistic Judaism. But again, that's now almost 50 years ago. He had a collection of his liturgical materials, Shabbats, holidays, life cycle events, most of which he wrote himself. And that was published in 1988, about 10 years later. And that was called Celebration. And that reflected the first 25 years of liturgy that he had created at the Birmingham Temple, the first humanistic Jewish congregation in suburban Detroit. But again, it reflected his values and his writing at the time. It had the generic male for a man, he, as opposed to people, they, in a more inclusive language. And some of the statements didn't stand the test of time, but some of them are still inspirational. And I still use passages from that book in my own congregation's work because some things are timeless. In 1985, but also in a revised version in 1995, he wrote a really thorough description of humanistic Jewish philosophy and identity called Judaism Beyond God, which is still very valuable in a detailed exploration of each of the holidays and life cycle events in more detail than we have in our book, because it was designed to explain a full philosophy of a movement, but also explicitly, here's how you do all these different things. And so that still has some value to it. And after he died, I wound up editing his History of the Jews, called A Provocative People, A Secular History of the Jews, which is a survey of Jewish history from a humanistic perspective. And again, wonderfully insightful and useful. So we certainly honor our founding thinkers, but we also feel like we have ideas too. Just like the Torah and the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, once they were completed, the rabbis had more comments to make. And so they created Midrash commentaries and the Mishnah as their statement of the laws. And then when the Mishnah was compiled around 220 of the Common Era, there were more comments to make and new circumstances they had to respond to. And this issue came up. And what about this problem? So then they created the Talmud, which is a commentary on the Mishnah. So it's a never-ending mountain of dialogue between generations. So we never saw this as replacing or eliminating the earlier works expressing our philosophy, just as Sherwin Wine's ideas were building on ideas of Mordecai Kaplan, who founded Reconstructionist Judaism, and Chaim Jitlovsky, who was an ideologue of secular Jewish schools, and Achad Ha'am, who was a cultural, they called him sometimes the agnostic rabbi or the cultural rabbi, thinking about the implications of a Zionist and Jewish state, Jewish majority state in Israel. So we all are standing on the shoulders of others, and it doesn't mean that we're replacing them. We see that we are adding to the conversation and dialogue. Judith, did you have any questions or comments as you were listening?
Yes, I do, and I can't put them in the Q&A since I'm a presenter, so I was trying to type it out, but it was very long. I was just, as I was reading the book, I noticed that there's a lot of talk about innovation and kind of the embrace of innovation, but also continuity. And just like kind of as an aside, I have the Apples and Honey music and readings for a secular humanistic observance of the Jewish New Year festival. And it looks like when this was published, there was a lot of like Yiddishism still in like secular humanistic Judaism. It's published by the by CSJO, so not SHJ, but so, or I guess you're kind of affiliated, but like I guess I'm curious about the evolution through the years of like I don't at this point see a lot of continuity with the Yiddishism, but that looks like it was at one time a really important piece, and I'm really curious about that. I guess like if you can talk a little bit about that.
So just to clarify, because you used acronyms, people might not know. So the
Sorry.
CSJO was at the time of that publication the Congress of Secular Jewish Organizations, and they were a network of Jewish schools and communities that came out of the Jewish left. They could no longer be explicitly communist after the McCarthy era, so they became focused on Jewish culture. But they still had lefty politics generally, and because they were focused on the Jewish people and they had been non-Zionist, because Jewish communists and Jewish Zionists didn't always get along, are you part of the Jewish workers on the kibbutz, or are you supporting the Jewish workers in every country along with all the other workers? And that, of course, was a big difference. So if you were part of the Jewish workers of the world, then you more often were focused on Yiddish language and culture. So you have the Workers' Circle, which also went by the Yiddish title Arbiter Ring. My mother actually grew up in a Sholem Aleichem Institute school. These are the children and grandchildren of immigrants from Eastern Europe who spoke Yiddish as their daily language, but they also saw Yiddish as the building block for a cultural Jewish identity. If they weren't religious theologically, and they weren't religious by lifestyle and practice, and they didn't keep kosher and they didn't go to synagogue, but they wanted to maintain a Jewish cultural identity, they felt that Yiddish language and Jewish history would be a good building block for that. So they focused a lot on Yiddish language. So CSJO was coming out of that Yiddishist Jewish socialist background. So when they created an anthology of songs and readings for a Jewish New Year, they wanted to include a lot of Yiddish sources. Now, in a humanistic Jewish context, we are not opposed to Yiddish, by no means. In fact, we use some Yiddish songs in our repertoire. Many people in our communities have Yiddish speaking or Eastern European Jewish heritage, and that's important to them. We do an exercise on the immigration to America experience, and that includes, at least in my school, some basic Yiddish vocabulary so they understand some of these words that get thrown around even today. But we don't speak Yiddish as a language anymore, most Jews. In fact, the Jews most likely to speak Yiddish as a language are ultra-Orthodox these days because they use it as a barrier to keep the outside world away, instead of their common ground to find with other workers in the working class, as it was 100 years ago. So we're not opposed to that, and we also occasionally will include Ladino songs, which is a Judeo-Spanish, medieval Spanish written in Hebrew letters, or other Jewish languages as they're relevant or as they provide some inspiration to us. They're part of the historical Jewish experience. But the reality is that Yiddish is less significant for secular Jewish identity today than it was 100 years ago, for nobody's fault. America is where people learn to speak the dominant language. And you can talk to Hispanic families who 2 and 3 generations on, oh, the grandkids don't speak enough Spanish, and why don't they know it? It's the same complaint in lots of communities. You get people who are from Japanese background who send their kids to Japanese school 3 and 4 days a week, just like we used to send our people to Hebrew school or Yiddish shulas like my mother went to 3 and 4 days a week. America is not good for foreign language. And the other thing we must say is the 2 major traumas of Jewish life in the 20th century both destroyed Yiddish. The Holocaust, which killed millions of Yiddish speakers, and the Soviet oppression under Stalin that wiped out the Yiddish language part, didn't kill all the Jews, but it killed off the Yiddish language and distinct Jewish culture in the Soviet Union. So between those 2 persecutions and the sort of integrationist experience in America, Yiddish is just not as big as it used to be. It's had a bit of a resurgence between klezmer music and some people beginning to learn Yiddish and a resurrection of an attachment to the Bund as a kind of non-Zionist or even anti-Zionist alternative, diasporist perspective on Jewish identity. So there's a sort of rebirth of Yiddish interest these days. But I don't know of people who are learning Yiddish in college and then speaking it to their babies so their kids grow up fluent. It's not going to be reborn in that kind of linguistic living context like Hebrew was in the early Zionist movement, as far as I know. But it'll be an interesting sort of sidelight of cultural literacy that people will dig into. And if they find it meaningful, there's a wonderful Yiddish phrase for it, Gesundheit, hey, go off and do what's good for you.
So, Marcia, I'm glad that you raised the question. I don't know that necessarily either of us has a definitive answer on how to approach a discussion about Israel and Hamas and the war. We have a chapter or an essay in the book by Rabbi Tzemach Yora on constructive conversation, because I think that even being able to begin a conversation and to be able to hear a different point of view takes a lot of heavy lifting. We tend to shut down if people are not in full agreement with us. We are humanistic Jews are kind of like any other group of Jews when it comes to Israel. There are pro-Zionists, there are anti-Zionists, there are sort of, I don't know, what would you call them, agnostic Zionists, like it isn't even an issue.
Zion-ish.
Zion-ish. I like that one. Yeah, Zion-ish. And it becomes difficult when we are sort of seeing a pairing of anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, that sometimes there is a reluctance to speak out against atrocities that might be committed by Israel in Gaza because of the fear of an anti-Semitic response to what we have to say. I think that it is an issue that is further dividing the Jewish community because there is no one single answer. I think also that every community, every humanistic community or congregation has its own unique culture. And understanding what that culture is can help guide you as to whether or not the high holidays are the place to have something like this, or is that kind of discussion, or is the discussion better had by hosting an really sort of an educational kind of a program where different viewpoints are going to be presented. I know, for instance, my own community, my own congregation, it's not particularly political. It's much more so about what kinds of community service can we be doing? How are we going to be educating our children? What kinds of meaningful services and life cycle events are we going to have? And that would be in contradistinction, for example, as I understand the community in DC, the Mahar, which, or even probably the city congregation, but I don't want to speak for either one of those. My sense from their leadership is that those are more political. It could be location, it could be the nature of who makes up their membership. So I think understanding first and foremost, is this something that would seamlessly fit in as a topic, is one point of guidance. If, on the other hand, it's going to feel as if you are taking a hammer to the people who are there attending when they're expecting one thing and they're getting something else, I think that you need to be sensitive to that as well.
I agree with everything that Rabbi Kornfeld said. In our dynamic, it's a little bit different because we are rabbis in a congregation. And so if we choose to bring up an issue and even open up a discussion, there's just a level of sort of control and civil behavior that people produce that may be harder if it's a purely lay-led group and nobody has any more authority than anybody else. That can be tricky unless you designate someone. This is the person who's going to run this conversation. I agree that a dialogue might be more effective than one person saying this is the message of what's happening currently in Israel or in Gaza or in the West Bank for that matter, which not enough people are aware of what's happening there. Ultimately, in my community, I've tried to cultivate a setting where I can say what I believe, but that doesn't mean you have to agree with me on everything. That part of our point of humanistic Judaism is that people can make up their own mind and people can come to their own conclusions. That's part of the point of empowerment, right? You're in charge of your life, and that means you get to evaluate the world and make your choices about what's happening and what it means and what I should do about it. I remember speaking of one of Sherwin Wine's early publications in his The Humanist Haggadah, which was written in the late 1970s. At one point in the service, he describes the symbol of the egg on the Seder plate, and then it says in the instructions, all present take an egg, salt it to improve its flavor, and eat it. And I've always thought to myself, what if I don't want to salt it? What if I don't like salt? Why do I have to salt? Why are you telling me what tastes right? You know? But that's part of that. This is humanistic Judaism. I'm telling you how it works, didactic approach that Rabbi Kornfeld described, where I'm much more interested in empowering people to make their own choices. I can share my analysis of what's happening and the meaning of it, but I also want to empower people to be able to disagree and to feel empowered to disagree with me. Some of the programs that we've done focused on what's been happening in Israel and Palestine since October 7th, almost 2 years now. Some of the programs have had people express very opposing opinions on what is happening and what should be happening. And then after the service is over, we chat with each other, we share an Oneg Shabbat, we're able to disagree as one community and still value each other's presence there. So really, if you're trying to choose an objective for raising the issue, in the community is not to prove one side is right or wrong, but you're enabling people to express how they're feeling, and they feel empowered to do that, and they feel acknowledged for that. And also, they feel represented. I've had people who say, I'm so glad you expressed some empathy for Palestinian suffering because I just don't hear it out there in my Jewish neighborhood. Or people who say, I'm glad you're willing to push back on this genocide accusation because it doesn't meet all the criteria. So the point is that finding a way to introduce the issue in a way that feels balanced, but also to enable people to express their feelings and thoughts on it is important. So rather than have someone make a statement on behalf of the community at the event, maybe empowering some kind of discussion setting or opening the topic and saying we're going to have a separate gathering that's going to focus on this. That might be more community building, which is the point of the high holidays, anyways.
I had a question about just like, is retention, like the Pew survey, I feel like highlighted a concern that the Jewish community at large has with retention of Jews. And so like, I was wondering, is that how much of a concern is that with humanistic Judaism? If it is a concern, is it like does it do well at that, I guess? So yeah, just that.
So if I'm understanding your question, there's sort of two ways that retention is bandied about in the Jewish community. One is, do we retain families as members once their kids have had their bar mitzvah? Because that is often a point of exit. That it's been referred to as pediatric Judaism. They're there only to educate the kids, and then they're gone. And then the larger question is retention of people, Jews, sort of as Jews. Like, is this going to be continue to be meaningful in their lives? I think that they overlap to a certain extent, but I think that when they're searching for data, like in Pew, it's more of the second, that kind of retention. So I'm gathering that that's where you're going with that question. So I think that one of the things that humanistic Judaism really has going for it is a couple. One is our very broad definition of Judaism, so that it is an identity based on culture, not solely religion. Religion's a part of culture, but not exclusively, not just the or even the main part. Secondly, humanistic Judaism is very welcoming and inclusive. And we included a statement by the Society for Humanistic Judaism in the book that's entitled Radical Inclusion. And I think that if you are welcoming of families that are interfaith or intercultural, then there's a good reason for them to stay. If, on the other hand, as often can be the case, families are excluded, or the non-Jewish partner is not a full participant in the community, that's very off-putting. And so if you start to have that as your message, implicit or explicit, that's going to drive Jews away. They're not going to want to continue to be interested in maintaining a Jewish identity, in passing along a Jewish identity. Our movement from the very beginning, our rabbis have always done interfaith marriage ceremonies. It's sort of one question: do you love each other? And if the answer is yes, I'm like, let me consult my calendar. So I think that kind of very broad welcoming, we have a self-definition of who is a Jew. If you identify with the Jewish experience and consider yourself Jewish, you're Jewish. We don't wave a magic wand and like confer that status on you. It is something that is, again, it's part of that empowerment. And I think that when people feel empowered, then, and that they realize that there are choices to be made, then humanistic Judaism becomes a very, very viable choice. And then the final thing on that point is sometimes I've kind of referred to this as Judaism by proxy. So I know back when my own grandfather died in 1986, I suddenly realized if this was going to be important to me, I had to take responsibility for it instead of he was the one who ran the Seder. He was the one who directed everything that was going on Jewishly in the family. And humanistic Judaism provides a really good option so that people don't identify, create their Jewish identity by proxy. It becomes something that's very personal to them.
I think one of our core messages is that if it's meaningful to you, then it's meaningful. There's no one answer to how to be Jewish or how to create Jewish community. And the more options available, the better. It used to be the case when I was growing up that at the bagel store, there were like 3 or 4 flavors: egg, plain, raisin, and salt. Like that was it. Nowadays, you go to a bagel store and they have Asiago cheese and chocolate chip and blueberry. And sometimes you get a purist who says, well, that's not really a bagel with chocolate chips. Well, it's the same with Judaism. Once upon a time, there were 3 Jewish denominations: Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, the end. Now there's humanistic and renewal and feminist and conservadox and modern Orthodox and open Orthodox and egalitarian minions and all these options. Great. I'm not going around saying that's not really a Judaism. I'm saying the more varieties of Judaism, the more ways people will find something that speaks to them, that's meaningful to them. So honestly, I think the Jewish establishment should be grateful that there's a humanistic Judaism out there and should promote us, because we could provide a meaningful connection to the people who are not interested in what they grew up with, who are not moved by the alternatives they've already experienced. We do something different. We really do Jewish differently and in a very meaningful way for those people who have a more secular lifestyle anyways. They shouldn't have to say things they don't believe to light Hanukkah candles. There should be humanistic alternatives, just as there are feminist alternatives and other alternatives for creating meaningful Jewish life. I did want to say one last thing about the first part of what Rabbi Kornfeld parsed the question as, in talking about kids and families and so on. The Chicago Jewish community did a survey about 15 years ago, and they found out that when they asked how many households, what percent of the households in Chicago have school-aged kids living in the house, as long as there's one Jewish person in the household. It turns out only about 25% of the households that had a Jewish person living in it had a school-aged kid. Because remember, you've got people living alone, you've got young adults living with roommates, you've got partners who are living together before they're married and even after they're married. They may have a baby, but that's not school age until they're 5, 6, 7. And then the kids are done with school at, is it 13? Is it 15? Is it 17? At a certain point, the kids are done. Then the parents become empty nesters. And then they become retirees. And they're living on their own and in their home longer and longer. And don't forget, there are plenty of people who never have children, may never get married by choice. So 3/4 of the households that had Jewish people living in them in Chicago did not have school-age kids living at home. Now, providing a school is very important for a community and for community growth, but this is not the 1950s, where people move into a town and join a synagogue because that's what everyone's doing. And they're going to send their kids there and they're going to be members there for life. Many people who join for their kids are joining for their kids. I am no longer involved in my children's middle school PTO because they are not in middle school anymore. They're done. If your community is focused in only doing outreach for school-age kids, you're missing large proportions of the Jewish community that can be part and find meaning in the community that you offer. So for LGBTQ families, for singles living alone, for people that didn't have children, you need to provide adult programming and things that are of interest to the adults. And don't forget, somebody who joins your congregation at age 65 because they just retired and now they finally have time to explore what's meaningful to them and to identify with what they're going to do the rest of their life, they could be an active and productive member for 25, even 30 years. So they're going to be involved and contributing and help the community grow and thrive as much as a school family that's there for 5 years or 10 years and maybe a small proportion of them stay as lifetime members. But for the people that join as adults, they're in for the lifetime membership because they're joined for themselves. So continuity is important, but focusing only on the kids is missing out on everybody else. And that's important too.
Well, let me just congratulate you, because when I first talked to you about arranging this book talk, I had not read the book through yet, and it is just like really some effort. It just outlines the philosophy so well, I think, and I'm really happy it's out there, and I hope it will do a lot for the movement and help people out a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Well, thanks to everyone who joined us as well. We really appreciate your comments and questions. And hopefully anybody else who watches this video in the future finds the book interesting. There should be a link for information on it below, and also a link for information on Kol Haskalah, which is the Triangle Congregation for Humanistic Judaism in North Carolina. Their high holiday services are coming up when everybody else's are at the end of the month. So hopefully, if you're visiting on this program, you'll be interested in joining them in person. I don't know if you're doing an online option or not. Some of our congregations are, but certainly if you're there in person, go in person.